and then play the game, it would just grab the old score from local storage. So reset score doesn't really work here. Let's press OK and fix this issue. So here in the reset score button, at the end, we're going to remove the score from local storage. So we'll type local storage and then a method called dot remove item and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to tell local storage which value we want to remove. So we're going to remove the score. So we'll type the string score. If we save and we click the reset button, and then we refresh the page and try to play the game again, unfortunately, it now gives us an error. So what is happening here? So remember that we removed the score from local storage. So now when we load the page, this actually doesn't exist. When something doesn't exist in local storage, it's going to give us a value called null. And at the bottom, if we try to access any property on null, it will give us an error. So that's what we see here. So how do we solve this problem? If we scroll up, one way to solve this problem is that if there is no score in local storage, we're going to give it a default value. Let's look at how we can do that. So after this line, we're going to check if the score is null. We can do that using an if statement. If, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll check if score is equal to null. And if it is equal to null, we're going to give this a default score. So inside the curly brackets, we'll just make the score equal to the default object we had earlier, which was wins 0, and then losses 0, and ties 0. And remember, if we need to reassign a variable, we have to change it from const to let. If we save, the score will be null because we removed it earlier, and now this will give it a default score. So everything should work as before. If we play the game, you'll notice that the score starts from 0, or this default score, and everything is working again. So that's how we create the score feature in the rock, paper, scissors project, as well as the reset score feature. Next, we're going to use some shortcuts to simplify our code. So these shortcuts are things that we learned in the Booleans lesson. So remember that null is a falsy value. That means it will behave just like false. So a shortcut we can use here is, instead of checking if the score is equal to null, we can also remove this and check if not score. So not score does the same thing as checking if it's null. If the score is null, not score will flip it into true. So both of these will return true. If the score exists, it's an object, then both of these will return false. So instead of checking if a value is equal to null, we can just use the not operator as a shortcut. Now, also from the Booleans lesson, we have an even shorter shortcut for doing this. So notice here that this code basically sets a default value if the score doesn't exist. In the Booleans lesson, we learned a technique called the default operator, which is exactly what we need here. So on this line, we can remove the semicolon and type or, and then a default value. So we want our default value to be this object. So let's select it and then right click, copy, and then here, right click and paste. And I'll select these lines and press Shift Tab to remove and indent. And I'll add a semicolon back at the end. So the way that the default operator works is that if the left side is truthy, so in this case, we have a score, it will use the left side. If the left side is falsy, or in this case, the score is null, then we will use the right side as a default value. So this does the same thing as this code below, but it's just a shortcut. So now let's comment out this code using /* and at the bottom */. So we'll leave it here just for reference and then save. And if we click reset score again and refresh and play the game, it will still work. So this is a perfect situation to use the default operator to simplify our code. So let's press OK. And that's all we're going to do for this project in this lesson. Now let's move on and learn more details about objects. The first thing we'll learn is the value null. So null is one of the falsy values in JavaScript. It's similar to the value undefined. They both represent that something doesn't have a value. So what's the difference between null and undefined? We use null when we intentionally want something to be empty. For example, in the previous lesson, we learned that if a function has parameters, we can give the parameter a default value. If the parameter is undefined, it will use the default value. However, if we set this parameter to null, it will not use the default value, and it will just use null. So null means we intentionally want something to be empty. In most cases though, null and undefined work the same way. Okay, so the next detail about objects we're going to learn is called auto boxing. Let's go back to objects.html and open the tab for this file. And let's also comment out the previous code so our console doesn't get too messy. So /* and at the bottom, */ and save. So let's scroll down. We learned in this lesson that objects can have properties and methods. So you might be surprised to learn that other values also have properties and methods. For example, at the bottom, we're going to type console.log, the string hello, and then the dot notation, and a property called length. So strings can also have properties. The length property tells us how many characters or letters are in this string. So hello has 5 letters, so if we save, the length property will be 5. Here's another example. We'll type console.log, the string hello, and then the dot notation and a method this time. To capital U upper, capital C case, and brackets. So this string also has a method called toUpperCase. And this method gives us a copy of the string with all letters capitalized or in uppercase. If we save, it will give us hello in capital letters. So as you can see, simple values like strings can also have properties and methods. So now you might be wondering, these are strings, not objects. How can strings have properties and methods? The answer is that JavaScript has a special feature called auto boxing. JavaScript automatically wraps this string in a special object first, and this object has the property length and the method toUpperCase. So this is done automatically. We don't see the special object that's wrapped around this string. So this feature is called auto boxing because JavaScript automatically wraps the string in an object, like a box. So auto boxing also works with other types of values, like numbers and booleans. The only thing is that auto boxing does not work with null and undefined. it would just give us an error. The last detail we're going to learn about objects is a really important detail, and that is objects are references. To demonstrate, let's create a new variable with an object. So const object1 and make it equal to an object. Inside this object, let's have a property message, colon, and the string hello. So you might think that when we create an object like this, we create a value that has other values inside, and we save the whole thing in a variable. However, this actually works a little differently. When we create this object, the actual value is created somewhere in the computer's memory. And this variable actually just gets a reference that points to that location in the computer's memory. This is like a shortcut on your computer. A shortcut points to where the actual file or folder is. So there's no way to actually see this reference, but just know that this is a reference, and the object is somewhere else in the computer's memory. So the reason it works this way is to make the language more efficient. For example, below this line, we can create a variable, const, and call it object2, and make it equal to object1. So this code doesn't actually make a copy of the object. It just makes a copy of the reference that points to the object. So this makes the language more efficient, because if we had a really big object here, it's not good to copy the entire object over and over again. Instead, JavaScript just copies the reference, which is much faster. This is called copy by reference. Now that we learned that objects are actually references, let's learn some interesting behaviors of references. So at the bottom here, we're going to change the property message in this object. We can do that by typing the object one.message property and make it equal to something else, like the string good job. And now if we console.log object1 and save, notice that we were able to change the message property even though we created object1 with const. And that's because this variable just contains a reference that points to the object. So const prevents us from changing the reference in the variable, but it doesn't prevent us from reaching into the reference and changing the object that it's pointing to. So just be careful when you're working with objects. Even though we use const, we can still change the values inside the object. Another interesting behavior is that on this line, we're not actually copying the object into this variable. We're copying the reference. So object2 actually has the same reference as object1. They actually point to the same object in the computer's memory. So at the bottom, if we type console.log object2 and save, you'll notice that for object2, the message property was also changed, even though we only changed object1. The last interesting behavior is that we can't compare objects directly. For example, let's go to the bottom and we'll create a new object using const object3, and we'll make it equal to an object. And then inside, we're going to have the same values as object1. So we'll have the property message, and the value is the string good job. So now let's try comparing object3 to object1. So here, we'll type console.log and check if object3 is equal to object1. If we save, it will tell us that these two objects are not equal to each other. even though they have the same values inside. And that's because, remember, objects are references. So object 3 also contains a reference. And this code compares the references and not the values inside the object. So because object 3 is a different reference than object 1, that's why this code results in false. If we did console.log and we check if object 2 is equal to object 1, object 2 has the same reference as object 1. It points to the same object in the computer's memory. So if we save, this will tell us that these two variables have the same reference. So just remember that when you're comparing two variables that contain objects, you're actually comparing the references, not the values inside. If we want to compare the values inside, we would do that manually by checking the message property against this message property. So don't worry, object references are a little confusing at first, but the more you work with it, the more you just get used to it. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson are some shortcuts for objects. So first, let's make a copy of object 3. We'll select the code and right-click, copy, and then at the bottom, we'll scroll down and right-click and paste. And let's rename this variable to object 4. So now let's say that we want to get the message property out of this object. We can do that by typing object 4.message. And now let's also say that we want to save this in a variable, also called message. So at the front, we'll type const message and make it equal to this value. So now, if the variable name and the property name are the same, we actually have a shortcut for this. To use a shortcut, we're going to type const and curly brackets message and make it equal to object 4. So this shortcut is called destructuring. This will take the message property out of object 4 and save it in a variable called message. So this line of code does the same thing as the code above. So let's comment out this line using // and we'll just keep it for reference. So at the bottom, if we type console.log message and save, it will display good job. So the destructuring shortcut took the property out of the object and saved it in this message variable. Next, we can use this destructuring shortcut for multiple properties. For example, let's add another property to this object using comma, and we'll add a price property, $7.99. And now we can take the price property out of this object by typing after message a comma and price. So this will take the price property out of the object and save it in a variable called price. If we console.log the price and save, it will display $7.99. So that's the destructuring shortcut. It's an easier way to take properties out of an object. The next shortcut we're going to learn is called the shorthand property. So at the bottom, let's create some new lines. And let's say we want to create a new object. So we'll type const, and let's name this object 5. And we'll make it equal to an object. And inside this object, let's say we want to create a message property. So we'll type message : and for the value, let's type the variable message. So what this does is that it takes whatever is inside the message variable and substitutes it into this code. So at the bottom, if we console.log object 5 and save, this object will have a property called message, and the value is whatever is inside the message variable, which is good job. So now we actually have a shortcut for this code. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can actually just type it out once, like message. So this code does the same thing as message:message, and this shortcut is called the shorthand property. So if we comment out this line using // and save, you can see that this shortcut creates the same object that we had before. The last shortcut we're going to learn is called the shorthand method. So at the end, let's create a new property, comma, and let's name it method, colon, and we'll save a function in this property. So we'll type function, and let's name it function1, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside this function, let's console.log method. And now here at the bottom, let's run this function by typing object5.method. So this will access this function, and we'll run it by typing brackets. If we save, this will run the code in the function and display method in the console. So we actually have a shortcut for writing this. So at the bottom, we can type method again and just type brackets and curly brackets, console.log string method. So this code does the same thing as the code above. So these brackets will create a function just like here. So this function name is actually not needed. So if we comment out these lines of code and save, it will still display method in the console because this is a shortcut for these lines of code. So this shortcut is called the shorthand method syntax. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned another type of value called objects. Objects group related values together. We added a score to our rock, paper, scissors game. We learned about built-in objects and used the JSON and local storage objects to save our score more permanently. We learned more details about objects like null, autoboxing, and references. And we learned some useful shortcuts like destructuring, shorthand properties, and shorthand methods. Here are some exercises to help you practice working with objects. In this lesson, we're going to learn one of the most important features of JavaScript called the Document Object Model, or the DOM. And we're going to use the DOM to improve our rock, paper, scissors project. So first, we'll create a new file for this lesson. Let's go to our code editor and click this icon to show our files, and then click this icon to create a new file. And we'll name this file 09-dom.html and press enter. Next, let's copy objects.html into dom.html. So we'll click here to open the file and then click inside and then type Control A or Command A to select the code and then right click, copy, and in here, right-click and paste. Now let's hide these files, and we'll prepare this file for this lesson. So let's scroll to the top, and we'll change the title to DOM, and let's delete all the JavaScript code from the previous lesson. Now let's save this file, and we'll open it in the browser by right-clicking, Open with Live Server. And let's also open the console on this page. We'll right-click, click Inspect, and then click the console. And now we can close the previous tabs, as well as the previous code for now. And for this lesson, we're going to do an extra step in the setup. Inside the body, we're going to create a button. So here, let's type the code less than button greater than. And inside the button, we'll have the text hello. Now let's save, and we should have a button on the page. And now we're ready to learn the document object model, or the DOM. In the previous lesson, we learned about objects, which group multiple values together. We also learned about built-in objects, which are objects that are provided by JavaScript. Some examples of built-in objects are console, math, JSON, and local storage. The DOM is another built-in object called the document object. So let's go to our script element, and we're going to type document. So this is a built-in object provided by JavaScript. And we've actually seen this document object before. In the first lesson, one of the first pieces of code that we learned was document.body.inner capital HTML equals the string hello and semicolon. So this code removes everything on the page and replaces it with the text hello. If we save, it will remove the button and just put hello. And now that we learned objects in the previous lesson, we can fully understand this syntax. Document here is a built-in object, and this is the dot notation. This means we're accessing a property of the document object called body. Now body is also an object, so we can use the dot notation again to access a property of the body object called inner HTML. And finally, we use an equal sign to change the inner HTML property to the string hello. But as you can see, there's something very special about the inner HTML property. When we change this property, it also changes the web page. So this document object and the web page are linked together. Let's do another example. We'll go to the end here and press enter, and we'll type the document object again, and we'll use the dot notation again. And this time, let's access the property title. And we'll change the title property using an equal sign, and we'll change it to the string good job. If we save, changing the title property will also change the title at the top of the tabs here. So now this says good job. Again, as you can see, the document object is linked to the web page. So from these examples, it shows us that the document object represents or models the web page. And that's why we call this feature the document object model, or the DOM. Now that we know what the DOM means, let's learn the syntax rules for the DOM. So the DOM is just this built-in document object, and this object works the same way as any other object. It contains properties like body and title that we can access using the dot notation. Now, the special thing about the document object is that it is linked to the web page. That means if we change certain properties in this object, it will also change the web page. Now, in addition to properties, the document object also has methods we can use, and we'll learn about them later in this lesson. Now that we understand the syntax of the document object, let's learn about the properties and methods we can use. First, let's comment out this previous code using /**//, and we'll create some new lines at the top. So the first property we're going to learn is called document.title. So this property will give us the title at the top of the tabs here. So if we console.log this property, console.log, and save, this will give us the text at the top, which is DOM, and that's what gets displayed in the console. If we change the document.title property, it will change the text at the top of the tab. So here, if we type document.title and make it equal to the string changed and save, now the title at the top of the tab will be changed. So as you can see, the title property is linked to the title at the top of the tab. We can use it to get the title, and we can also use it to change the title. Next, we're going to learn another property called document.body. So let's go into our code, and let's type document.body. Now, document.body is a very special property. So this will literally get this body HTML element and put it inside our JavaScript. So let's actually console.log this to see how it works. Console.log, open bracket, and then close bracket, and save. And inside the console, it will tell us that document.body is the body HTML element. And if I hover over this, it will tell us that it is exactly the body on our page. If I expand this, you can see that this code is exactly the code that we have here. And this shows us one of the most important features of JavaScript. We can have HTML elements inside JavaScript. The document object, or the DOM, combines JavaScript and HTML together, and it gives JavaScript control of the web page. Okay, so now that we have an HTML element inside our JavaScript, what can we do with it? A really important thing to know is that when an HTML element is inside our JavaScript like this, the HTML element is converted into a JavaScript object. So for example, if we do console.log type of document.body and save, it will tell us that the body HTML element is just an object when it's inside JavaScript. So just like any other object, this has properties and methods we can use. So one useful property of the body element is inner HTML, which we saw earlier. So down here, let's type document.body.inner capital HTML. So the inner HTML property controls all the HTML inside the body. That's why it's called inner HTML. So if we access this property, it will give us all the HTML inside the body. So let's console.log to confirm. Console.log and save. And inner HTML will give us all of this HTML inside the body element. And if we change the inner HTML property, it will change the HTML inside the body element. So let's create a new line, and we'll type document.body.inner capital HTML, and we'll change it to the string changed. So this will replace all of the HTML inside the body with the text changed. If we save, that's exactly what it does. And we can actually confirm this by going into the Elements tab. So this tab is for HTML and CSS. We can find the body element, expand it, and you can see all of the HTML that we had before was replaced with changed. And don't worry about this part. This part is just added by live server after. So this shows that inner HTML gives us control of all the HTML inside the body. We can get this HTML, and we can also change this HTML. Now, another feature of inner HTML is that we can replace this HTML with new HTML code, not just text. So for example, instead of just text, we can replace it with the code less than, button, greater than, and also less than / button, greater than. So this is HTML code for creating a button. And inside the button, let's put the text, good job. And now this code will replace all the HTML inside the body with this new HTML. If we save, it removes all the previous HTML, and this new HTML creates this button. So using this inner HTML property, JavaScript can replace the HTML inside the body to whatever we want. We have full control of the web page. All right, now we're going to learn a method of the document object that we can use. As a reminder, a method is a function that is saved inside an object. So we're going to learn a very important method called document.querySelector. We just learned that document.body lets us get the body element and put it inside our JavaScript. Document.querySelector lets us get any element from the page and put it inside our JavaScript. Let's give it a try. So first, we'll comment out the previous code using /* and //. Let's create some new lines at the top. And let's type document.query capital S selector and brackets. So document.querySelector lets us get any element from the page and put it inside our JavaScript. Between these brackets, we're going to put a string. This string tells JavaScript which HTML element to get from the page. So if we type button, this will get the first button element from the page and put it inside our JavaScript. So let's console.log this to confirm. Console.log, close bracket, and save. And let's go back to our console. Now it will tell us that document.querySelector got this button element and put it inside our JavaScript, which you can see in the console. And if I hover over this button element, it will tell us that it is exactly the button on the page. So that's what document.querySelector does. It can get any element from the page and put it inside our JavaScript. This string tells it which element to get. If we type button, it will get the first button element from the page. If we type body, this will now get the first body element from the page. So it will do the same thing as document.body. But for now, Let's just change this back to button as an example and save. So remember, when an HTML element is inside JavaScript, it's just a JavaScript object. So this button element is also just an object, and it has properties and methods we can use. Every HTML element actually has a property called inner HTML, which lets us control the HTML inside the element. So for this button element, let's type at the end dot inner HTML, and this will give us the HTML inside the button. If we save, it will give us hello. And again, if we change the inner HTML property, it will change the HTML inside the button. So let's make a copy of this code. We'll select it and right-click copy. And down here, right-click and paste. And let's change the inner HTML property using an equal sign and the string changed. So this will only change the HTML inside the button, which is here, to changed. If we save, you can see that the text inside the button is now changed. A little syntax shortcut I'm going to show you is that for the dot notation, we can actually put it on multiple lines. So we can type document.querySelector and then put dot inner HTML on a separate line to make it easier to read. And make sure to put a tab at the front so that we know it's a continuation of the previous line. Okay, so using document.querySelector, we can get any element from the page, put it inside our JavaScript, and then we can control the HTML inside that element. And this allows us to only change the parts of the page that we need. Next, what if we have two buttons on the page? So let's go up here and we'll create another button using less than button greater than. And we'll have the text second button and save. So now we have two buttons on the page, but document.querySelector will only get the first button on the page. How do we get this second button? The solution is that we're going to add an attribute to this button called the class attribute. So in the opening tag, we're going to type space class equals double quotes. So the class attribute sort of adds a label to this button. So inside the double quotes, we're going to label this button a JS-button. And now that we labeled this button, we can select it using document.querySelector. So at the bottom here, we'll type document.querySelector again, and brackets, and we'll type a string inside. And this time, we're going to start with a dot. When we start with a dot, this means that it's going to look for a class rather than an element name. So we're going to look for the class JS-button. And now document.querySelector will select an element with the class JS-button, which is this element here. So let's confirm this by console.logging this code and save. And now you will see that this code gives us the second button on the page. So using a class attribute and then starting with a dot in querySelector, we can get any specific element from the page and put it in our JavaScript. By the way, when we start with a dot, this is called a class selector. And this is also used in CSS to style elements with a specific class. In fact, anything we use in CSS can also be used in this string. And also, a common practice is to start the class with JS dash to make it clear that this class is being used in JavaScript. And again, HTML elements are JavaScript objects. So this second button is also just an object. And remember, objects are values, and we can save them inside a variable. So instead of console.log, let's create a variable using const, and we'll name the variable button capital E element. We usually end the variable name with element or lm to make it clear there's an HTML element inside this variable. And finally, we'll type an equal sign to save this element. And we can remove this extra bracket. And now if we console.log this variable, console.log button element, and save, it will tell us that the second button was saved inside this variable. So using the DOM, we can get HTML elements from the page, put it inside a JavaScript, and then save it in a variable. So the DOM combines JavaScript and HTML together. It gives JavaScript full control of the web page. All right, now that we learned how to use the DOM, let's do some practical examples. So I've actually prepared some projects that we can do for this lesson. To open these projects, we'll go to our browser and create a new tab at the top. And here we'll type supersimple.dev/projects/DOM and press enter. On this page, we'll be working on 3 projects: the YouTube subscribe button, the rock, paper, scissors project we've been working on for the last few lessons, and this Amazon shipping calculator. And you'll notice that these projects modify the web page. So we're going to be using the DOM to create these projects. And in the next lesson, we're going to use CSS to style these projects and make them look nice. And you can preview that by clicking here. So using CSS, we can make the subscribe button look like the actual subscribe button on YouTube. And if we click this link to see the rock, paper, scissors game, you'll see that we'll make it look really nice with these icons. But for this lesson, we're only going to focus on the functionality and not the styling. So let's go back to the projects. We'll click back and click back again until we're at projects/DOM. And we're going to create the functionality for these projects first. So before we start, let's create a new file just for these projects. We'll go to our code editor and click this icon, and then click this icon to create a new file. Let's name this file 09-dom-projects.html and press enter. Now let's copy dom.html into this file. So we'll open it and then click in here and type Control-A or Command-A to select the code, and then right-click, copy, and in here, right-click and paste. Now let's close our files and we'll prepare this file. So let's scroll up and we'll change the title to DOM projects. And let's remove our HTML, but keep the script element. And we'll also remove the JavaScript from before. Finally, let's save this file, and we'll open it in the browser by right-clicking, Open with Live Server. And let's also open the console just in case. Right-click, click Inspect, and then click the console. All right, we're ready to start with the projects. Let's go back to supersimple.dev, and we'll start by creating the YouTube subscribe button. Let's actually press refresh to get it back to normal. And when we click this button, it will change to subscribed. First, let's create the HTML elements for this project. We'll go to the body, we'll create some new lines, and let's create the paragraph first. We'll type less than p greater than, and inside the paragraph, we'll have the text YouTube subscribe button. And now let's create the button. So on the next line, we'll type less than button greater than. And inside the button, subscribe. Now let's save and go back to our tab. And now we have the HTML elements that we need. So now let's make this interactive with JavaScript. And remember, we have a process for this. First, we'll figure out what steps we need to do. This is called an algorithm. And then we'll convert these steps into code. So the steps that we need here are when we click this button, if the text is subscribe, we'll change it to subscribed. Otherwise, we'll change it back. Now let's convert these steps into code. Let's go to our button element, and we're going to add an onClick attribute. We'll type space onClick equals double quotes, and inside here, we'll write some JavaScript. So first, we need to get the text inside the button, and we learned how to do this earlier. We can use document.querySelector to put this button into our JavaScript and then use inner HTML to get this HTML inside the button. So in our code, let's type document.querySelector, brackets, and a string. And as we learned, we're going to use a class attribute to select this specific button. So in the opening tag, let's add a class attribute, and let's make the class js-subscribe-button. And then inside document.querySelector, we're going to type a dot to select a class, and we're going to select the class js-subscribe-button. And now let's console.log this to confirm that we got this button. So at the front, console.log, and save. And now let's click our button, and it will show us that document.querySelector got the button on the page. So now let's save this button in a variable so we can use it later. Instead of console.log, let's type const to create a variable, and we'll name it button element and make it equal to this result. So now that we have the button inside our JavaScript, we're going to check if the text inside the button is subscribe. To check the text, we can use an if statement. So at the bottom here, we're going to type if, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside this condition, let's get the text inside the button. So we'll type button element dot inner capital HTML. And we're going to check if it's equal to subscribe. So we'll type triple equal the string subscribe. Now, if it is equal to subscribe, inside the curly brackets, we're going to change the text in the button to subscribed. So let's type the code button element dot inner capital HTML, and we'll change it with an equal sign to the string subscribed. And the last step is otherwise, we'll change it back. So we'll add an else to this if statement. Else and curly brackets. And inside, we're going to change the text back to subscribe. So let's type button element dot inner capital HTML and make it equal to the string subscribe and save. Now, before you try out this project, make sure that the text inside the button has no spaces or new lines around it, and it looks like this. And I'll show you why in a second. Let's go to our project and try it out. So when we click this button, it will change to the text subscribed. If we click it again, it will go back to the original text. So that's how we create the subscribe button project using the DOM. So now let's go back into our code, and I'll show you why if we add new lines and some spaces around this text, there's actually going to be some problems. So if we save this code and then go back to our project and click the button again, you'll notice that it no longer changes the text. And that's because now we have a bunch of spaces around this text, and these spaces will show up in inner HTML. And now inner HTML will not equal exactly subscribe. So how do we solve this problem when there are spaces around our text? To solve this, we're going to use a different property of an HTML element. So instead of the inner HTML property, we're going to use the property inner capital T text. So inner text will give us the text inside this element, but without all these spaces around it. So now this will equal exactly subscribe. If we save and go back to our project and click it again, it'll start working again. So that's the inner text property of an HTML element. It gets us the text without the extra spaces. So before we move on to the second project, I'm going to show you how to make our code cleaner. Right now, we're mixing HTML and JavaScript together. So to make our code cleaner and easier to read, we're going to separate the JavaScript code. And to do that, we're going to put this code in a function instead. So inside the script element, let's create a function using function, and we'll name the function subscribe brackets and curly brackets. And inside these curly brackets, we're going to move all of this code. So let's select this code, and we'll right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. And if we need to fix the formatting, we can select these lines and press tab a few times. And now that we have this function, we're going to go to the onClick attribute, and we're going to call this function. So we'll type the function name, subscribe, and brackets. So this will run all the code inside the function. So it will do the same thing as before, except now our code is cleaner because we grouped all the JavaScript code at the bottom, and we're no longer mixing as much HTML and JavaScript together. Now let's move on to the second project. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and we're going to work on the rock, paper, scissors project. So let's click this link, and it will show us the next version of this project. So you'll notice a few changes here. The first change is that we're going to show the score on the page instead of in a pop-up. And the second change is that when we click one of these buttons to play the game, it will show us the result and the moves that we picked on the page rather than in a pop-up. Let's create a new file for this rock, paper, scissors game for this lesson. So let's go to our code editor and we'll click this icon and click this icon to create a new file. And we'll name this 09-rock-paper-scissors.html and press enter. And let's copy the previous rock, paper, scissors, which is here. We'll click here and type Control A or Command A, right click, copy, and here, right click and paste. And let's hide our files. And let's save this file. And we can also close 08 rock, paper, scissors. And finally, we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. Now we're ready to begin the second project. So let's go back to the project at Super Simple Dev, and we're going to start by putting the score on the page. So to do this, we're going to need somewhere to put the score. So let's create an HTML element for this. We'll scroll up to our HTML, which is here. And after the scissors button, let's add a paragraph element where we're going to put our score. So less than, p greater than. And let's add a class attribute so we can select this element in our JavaScript. So in the opening tag, we'll type space class equals double quotes js-score. Now that we have a class, let's get this element in our JavaScript. So let's just do it down here. So we'll type document.query selector, brackets and a string, and then we're going to type a dot, and we're going to select the class js-score. So js-score. So this will get the paragraph element from above and put it inside our JavaScript. And now let's put the score inside the element. To do that, we can use inner HTML. Dot inner capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the score. If we scroll down, we actually create the score down here. So we can actually just copy this string. So we'll select it, right click, copy, and let's scroll up to here. And I'll actually put this on a separate line to make it easier to read. And now here, we're going to type a string using backticks. And inside the string, we're going to right click and paste. So this will put the score that we used to have in our pop-up inside this element. So inside this paragraph. If we save and then go back to our tab, you can see that now it displays the score on the page. Now, before we move on, I want to point something out with HTML. So remember that our reset score button was beside our other buttons, and now it's below them. So what determines if an element appears beside something or below something? So the paragraph element here is known as a block element. A block element will always take up an entire line by itself. So this line already has some buttons, so the paragraph will take up the entire line under the buttons. That's why this text appears under the buttons and not beside them. And also, because a block element like this paragraph takes up this entire line, the next button has to appear below it. So that's why we get this layout here. So this is just a short review of layouts. If you want to learn this in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. All right, the next feature we're going to do is if we play the game, we also want to update the score. Right now, if we play, it doesn't update it on the page. Let's fix this in our JavaScript. So let's go down to where we update the score. So we'll scroll down, which is right here. We update the score and save it in local storage. And after we do this, we're also going to update the score on the page. So we can actually use the same code that we used above, which is here. So let's make a copy of this code, right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And I'll add a tab at the front. If we save and then try out our game, we'll click a move, press OK, and now you'll notice the score also updates on the page. So let's go back into our code and do some cleanup. So you notice that this code is the same as the code we had above. And this is a great situation to use a function to reuse this code. So at the bottom here, let's create a function using function, and we'll call it update score element, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll move this code into the function. So we'll select it, right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. And now instead of writing this code multiple times, we're just going to call the function update score element and brackets. This will run all the code inside the function, so it does the same thing as before, except we can reuse the code. So let's scroll back up, and instead of typing out all this code again, we can just use our function update score element and brackets. Now let's save. It will display the score on the page at the start, and when we click a move and click OK, it will update the score on the page. So the last feature we're going to do in relation to the score is when we click the reset score button, we also want to update the score on the page. Right now, if we click it, it doesn't actually update it. So let's go into our code and let's go to the reset button, which is here. And after we reset the score, we're going to call that function again, update score element and brackets. If we save, and now let's play the game and press OK. So we have a score, and if we click reset score, it will reset everything back to 0. So now we finished the score. Let's go back to Super Simple Dev and play the game. And now we're going to work on this section. We're going to show the result and the moves that we picked on the page. So first, let's create some paragraphs for these as well. We'll go to our HTML, and above the score, let's add a less than p greater than. This is going to be the result. So let's give it a class of js-result. And let's create another paragraph, less than p greater than. And we'll give this one a class equals js-moves. Now let's use the DOM to put the result and the moves in these paragraphs. Feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself first. So let's scroll down to where we display the result, which is here. So we display it in a pop-up. And instead of a pop-up, we're going to get the paragraph and put this result inside the paragraph. So we'll type document.query selector, brackets, and a string, and we'll type a dot and select the class JS dash result, and then dot inner capital HTML, and we'll change this to result. And now let's also display the moves. So we'll type some new lines and document dot query selector again, brackets and a string, dot js dash moves, dot inner capital HTML, and make it equal to this text right here. So let's type a template string because we're going to insert our moves inside the string, and we'll type U, and we'll insert the player move, dollar curly brackets, player move, and then a dash, and then the computer's move. So dollar curly brackets again, and computer move, computer at the end. So now that we're displaying everything on the page, we don't need this pop-up at the end. So we can actually delete this pop-up. All right, now let's save and go back to our tab and play our game. Now it will show the result and the moves that we picked on the page instead of in a pop-up. Let's play it again to make sure it works. And finally, when we click reset score, it will reset everything back to 0. And that's it. Now we're displaying everything on the web page using the DOM. Now let's move on to the third and final project. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and we'll click back to go back to our projects. And we're going to create this third project here, which is an Amazon shipping calculator. The way this works is that inside this text box, we're going to type the cost of an order in dollars. If the order is under $40, for example, $25, and we click calculate, it will add $10 of shipping and display the total down here. But if we type a cost that is over $40, like 50, and press calculate, it will be free shipping. So it will display the same total down here. So let's learn how to create this using the DOM. Let's go back to our 09 DOM projects file, and we'll start by creating the HTML elements. So under our subscribe button, let's create this paragraph using less than p greater than Amazon shipping calculator. And next, let's create this text box. So the HTML element for a text box is called input. So we'll type less than input greater than. So the input element is special because it doesn't require a closing tag. This is called a void element. And lastly, let's create the button. So here, we'll create less than button greater than calculate. Now let's save and open the tab for this file, which is right here. And we have the text box, and the button that we need. Now, one other thing we're going to add is that in the final project, if we don't have anything in the text box, we're going to have this gray text. So this is called a placeholder. To add a placeholder to a text box, we're going to use the placeholder attribute. So inside our input element, we're going to type space placeholder equals double quotes. And inside the quotes, we'll put the text we want as the placeholder, which is cost of order, and save. Now, if we go back to our project, we now have a placeholder in our text box that disappears when we start typing. So that's all the HTML that we need. Now let's work on the JavaScript. And again, we'll figure out what steps we need to do. So when we click this button, we're going to get the text inside the text box. If the amount is below $40, we'll add $10 of shipping, and then we'll display the total on the page. Let's convert these steps into code. So we'll go to our button and add an onClick attribute. And inside here, let's also create a function to separate our JavaScript code like we did before. So in the script, we're going to create a function, and let's name it calculate total, brackets and curly brackets. And inside onClick, we're just going to call the function. So calculate total, brackets. The next step is to get the text inside the text box. So first, let's get this input element and put it inside our JavaScript. To do that, we can use document.querySelector again. So we'll add a class to this input so we can select it. Class equals js-cost-input. And then inside our JavaScript, we'll use document.querySelector, brackets, and a string, and a dot, and this class, js-cost-input. So this code will get the input element and put it inside our JavaScript. Let's confirm by console.logging the result and save. And now when we click the calculate button, it will give us the input element from the page. Let's save this input element in a variable so we can use it later. Instead of console.log, we'll use const, and we'll name the variable input element and make it equal to this element and remove the extra bracket. And next, we need to get the text inside the input element. So far in this lesson, we've been using the property inner HTML to do this. However, for input elements, you'll notice that there is no HTML inside. So for input elements, we're going to use a different property called value. So at the bottom here, we're going to type input element dot value. This is how we get the text inside a text box. So let's console.log this to confirm that it works. So we'll console.log and save. And now let's type something in the text box like 50 and click calculate. And input.value will give us the text inside the text box. Let's save this text in a variable so we can use it later. Const, and we'll name the variable cost and make it equal to the text in the text box. The next step is to check if this cost is under $40. If it is, we'll add $10. So down here, let's type if, brackets and curly brackets, and inside the condition, we'll check if cost is less than 40. And if it is, inside the curly brackets, we'll do cost equals itself plus $10 of shipping. And remember, when we change a variable, we have to switch from const to let. And finally, we're going to display the total cost on the page. So let's create a paragraph where we can display the cost. So down here, we'll create a paragraph less than p greater than. Let's give it a class js-total-cost. And now inside our JavaScript, let's use document.query selector, brackets and string, and we'll type a dot and the class js-total-cost. And we're going to put the cost inside the paragraph. We can use dot inner capital HTML and make it equal. And let's use a template string. So backticks, and we'll have a $, and we're going to insert the cost using $ and curly brackets, cost. Now let's save and try out this project. So first, we'll type a cost that is over $40, like 50. If we press calculate, we're not going to add $10 of shipping, and we'll display the same total on the page. Now let's try a number under $40, like 25, and press calculate. And this number doesn't look right. It's saying that we have to pay $2,510. So what's going on here? Let's go into our code, and let's use console.log to figure out what's wrong. So first, let's console.log the cost to make sure that we're getting the right number from the text box. So down here, console.log the cost and save. And then let's type 25 again and press calculate, and it will give us 25. So we're getting the correct text from the text box. Now let's console.log down here to see if the math is working. So we'll type console.log cost and save. And let's try 25 again and calculate. And down here, when we add 10, this is where things go wrong, and it results in 2,510. So it's not doing math properly here. So let's check if cost is a number to make sure that it's doing math. So here, we'll type console.log the type of cost and save. Let's type 25 again and calculate, and aha, it's telling us that the cost is a string. So this is actually not a number, it is a string. That's why it's not doing math. So remember from the strings lesson, when we add a string with a number, JavaScript will automatically convert this number into a string and combine them together. That's why it just combines 25 and 10 here. This is called type coercion. So whenever we get a value from the DOM like this, the value will be a string. So in order to do math, we have to manually convert this string into a number. To do that, JavaScript has a built-in function called number. So before this code, we're going to type capital N number, open bracket, and close bracket. So the number function takes whatever's between the brackets and manually converts it into a number. So now if we save and we type 25 and press calculate, the cost is now a number, and it will do the math properly and give us 35. So remember, whenever we get a value from the DOM, the value will be a string. So if we want to do math with it, we have to manually convert this value into a number first. So now let's remove the console.logs that we used to figure out this problem. And save. Okay, we're going to add one more feature to this project. Let's go back to supersimple.dev, and inside the text box, we're going to type 25 and press enter. So pressing enter will also calculate the total and display it on the page. So let's learn how to create this feature. So if we go back to our code, so far in this course, we've been using the attribute onClick, which runs some JavaScript when we click an element. HTML has another attribute we can use called onKeyDown, which runs JavaScript when we press a key down on our keyboard. So inside the input this time, let's add the attribute onKeyDown equals double quotes, and then inside here, console.log and the string typing. So now every time we type in the input, it will console.log this message. Let's save it and give it a try. We'll go to the tab for this file, and then inside the text box, we'll type some numbers. And you can see that every time we type something, it will run this code and display this message. So that's how we do something when we type in an element. So clicks and keydowns are known as events. OnClick and onKeyDown are known as event listeners. They check for events and runs JavaScript when those events happen. Now, in addition to clicks and keydowns, there are many other events we can listen for in JavaScript. Okay, so now let's figure out what steps we need to do for this project. When we press a key down in the text box, we're going to check if the key is the Enter key. If it is, we'll do the same thing as the Calculate button. So how do we know what key we pressed? Inside onKeyDown, we're actually given a special object called event. So instead of this string, let's remove it, and we'll console.log event. So this is an object that's provided to us by JavaScript, and it contains information about the event. Every event listener, including onClick, also gets an event object. If we save and type in this text box, it will show us that event is this object. And inside the object, it has a bunch of information, including the key that we typed. So here, let's use the event object, and we'll get .key and save. So now inside this text box, if we type something, it will tell us the key that we pressed. And if we press enter, it will tell us that the key is enter. So the next step is to check if the key is enter. And we can do that using an if statement. So in our code, we'll type a new line, if brackets and curly brackets, and inside the condition, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string enter. If it is equal to enter, we're going to do the same thing as the calculate button. So we can actually just use this function again. Inside the curly brackets, we'll type calculate total and brackets and save. So now let's go back to our project and type 25 enter, and it will calculate the total and display it on the page. So that's how we create this keyboard feature of this project. Lastly, let's clean up our code and move this into a function like the rest of our code. So inside the script element, let's create a new function using function, and we'll name it handle cost key down brackets and curly brackets. And let's move this code into the function. We'll select it, right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. If we need to fix the formatting, we can select these lines and press tab. And let's remove this console.log. And now up here, we're going to call this function. handle cost key down and brackets. Now, the last thing we have to do is that event does not exist inside this function. So we have to put the event object into the function. And remember, to put a value into a function, we can use a parameter. So between these brackets, we can create a parameter called event. And now to save something inside this parameter, we're going to go up to these brackets and type event. This will take the event object and put it inside the function, where we can use it just like a variable. So now if we save and try out the project, 25, enter. So this still works. And now we've finished all 3 projects in this lesson. So in the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn some more details about JavaScript. In the last project, we learned how to manually convert a string into a number using the number function. We can also convert the other way, from a number to a string. So let's go to the top of the script element, and we can type capital S string and brackets. So the built-in string function will convert a value into a string. Between the brackets, we can put a number like 25, and this will convert the number into the string 25. The next detail we're going to learn is a special behavior of strings. So below this line, we can type console.log the string 25 minus 5. So if a string only contains a number and we subtract, multiply, or divide, JavaScript will automatically convert this string into a number. So this gets converted into the number 25 minus 5. And if we save, it will do math and give us 20. So this is another example of type coercion or automatic type conversion. However, it's not recommended to do math with strings like this because adding works differently. For example, on a new line, let's type console.log the string 25 plus 5 and save. This will convert the number into a string and combine them together into 255. So because adding strings works differently, the best practice is always do math using numbers. Don't do math using strings. If we need to, we can manually convert the string into a number using the number function, like we did here. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is another built-in object called the window object. So in this lesson, we learned about the document object. The document object represents the web page. The window object represents the browser. So let's go into our script element and try it out. Below this, we'll type window. So this is the window object, and it represents the browser. Because it represents the browser, everything inside the browser is inside the window object. So let's think, what's inside the browser? Well, the web page is inside the browser. So the document object is inside the window object. If we type window.document, this will give us the same document object that we've been using in this lesson. So what else is part of the browser? Well, the console is also part of the browser. So here, if we type window.console, this will give us the same console object we've been using in this course. So we can actually do console.log and the string window and save. And this will do the same thing as console.log. What else is part of the browser? Well, pop-ups are also part of the browser. So if we type window.alert, this will give us the same alert function that we've been using in this course to create pop-ups. However, you might have noticed that we never type window.document or window.console.log. And that's because the window object has a shortcut. We don't have to type window dot at the front. We can just type document or console, and JavaScript will automatically add window dot at the front for us. So window is a built-in object that represents the browser. We don't have to type out window dot ourselves because JavaScript adds it for us automatically, but it's still nice to know how this works behind the scenes. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned about the document object model, or the DOM, which allows JavaScript to fully control the web page. We learned how to use document.querySelector to get elements from the web page and put them inside our JavaScript. We learned how to use inner HTML to modify the HTML inside an element. We worked on 3 projects using the DOM. We learned how to make elements interactive with the keyboard using onKeyDown, and we learned some more details about strings, as well as the window object, which represents the browser. Here are some exercises you can do on your own to practice using the DOM. In this lesson, we're going to add CSS to all of our projects, and we're going to finish our rock, paper, scissors project. CSS is a different language that changes the appearance of our website. It's one of the 3 languages that we use to create websites. So first, let's look at the projects we're going to work on in this lesson. We'll go to our browser and create a new tab at the top. And here, we're going to type supersimple.dev/projects/dom-with-css and press enter. So these are the same 3 projects we created in the previous lesson, except this time we're going to add CSS to make these projects look nice. Let's start by creating a copy of the project's HTML file from the previous lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click this icon to show our files. And then here, we're going to select 09-dom-projects. We're going to right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And let's rename this file by right-clicking, rename. At the end, we're going to remove copy, and at the beginning, we're going to change it to 10 and press enter. Now let's hide our files, and we're going to open 10 DOM projects in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. Now we can close our previous tabs, as well as the previous code from lesson 9, which is this file and these 2. And now we're ready to add CSS to our projects. We'll start with the YouTube subscribe button. Let's go to the tab for our project, and we're going to style this button first. So we reviewed CSS in lesson 4. And one of the ways we can write CSS code is using the style element. So inside the head section, we're going to create an element using less than, style, greater than. So the style element lets us write CSS code inside. So inside here, we're going to write button open curly bracket, close curly bracket. So the code in front of the brackets is called the CSS selector. This tells the computer which elements we want to style or change the appearance. So button will style all button elements on the page. But in this situation, we only want to style the subscribe button because the calculate button will be styled differently. So to style a specific element, we can use the class attribute. So if we look at our button, currently it already has a class of JS subscribe button. But this class is being used by our JavaScript. A good practice is to add a different class that would be used by CSS. So an element can have multiple classes. We just separate them with a space. So inside this class attribute, we're going to type space and add another class, subscribe dash button. Now this element has two classes, and we're going to use this second class in our CSS. So to style a specific class, we're going to remove button, and we're going to type a dot. So starting with a dot means we're going to style a class rather than an element name. So we'll style the class subscribe dash button, which is this button right here. And now inside these curly brackets, we're going to tell the computer how to style this button. For example, border, colon, none, and semicolon. If we save, this will remove the border from the button. So it no longer has a border like this button. So that's how we style a specific element with CSS. We add a class to the element, and then inside CSS, we start with a dot and the class. And between the curly brackets, the code on the left is called the property. This tells the computer what we want to change. On the right is called the value. This tells the computer what we want to change the property to. We separate the property and value with a colon, and we end the whole thing with a semicolon. So this is also called a property value pair. As a reminder, this is just a review of CSS. If you want to learn CSS in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. So we just added one style to this button. We're going to add more styles so that it looks like our final design. To make this easier, I'm going to rearrange my windows, and I'm going to put the final design at the bottom and then our project at the top. This will make it easier to compare the two designs. Next, to make it look like the final design, we're going to style our element one by one. Let's go back to our code and press enter. And next, let's change the background color to black. To do that, we'll type background dash color colon black and semicolon and save. Now our button has a black background. Let's keep going one by one. We'll change the text color to white next. So in our code, we'll type color colon white and semicolon and save. Now, if you're wondering how I know all these properties, you can usually find them by searching in Google. Just make sure you search for what you are trying to do. Let's keep going one by one. The next thing we'll change is we're going to add spacing on the inside of the button. In CSS, space on the inside of an element is called padding. So we'll create a new line, and we'll use the property padding dash top colon 10px and save. So this will add space on the inside of the element called padding at the top of 10px. So the px here means pixels. A pixel is a unit of measurement in computers. Your screen is made up of many small little squares. Each of these squares is called a pixel. So a pixel is the smallest thing that you can have on your screen. Screen sizes are measured in pixels. Images and video sizes are also measured in pixels. And don't worry, the more you work with pixels, the more you'll get used to how big a pixel is. So in this example, 10 pixels is equal to this amount of space, and it looks pretty close to the final design. So let's keep going. We'll add space on the inside of the element at the bottom this time. So we'll create a new line and type padding dash bottom colon 10px again and save. And that adds space at the bottom of the element of 10 pixels. Next, let's increase the space on the left and the right. We'll go into our code and add padding dash left colon 10 pixels and padding dash right colon 10 pixels. Let's save. And it added some extra space on the left and right, but I think our final design has a little more space on the left and right. So let's go back and increase our padding. So instead of 10, let's try 15 on both sides. So we'll save, and now the spacing looks close enough to the final design. So in CSS, it's normal to do some trial and error to get the styling right. Let's keep styling this one by one. Next, we'll make the text thicker or bold. So let's go into our code, and to change the thickness of the text, we'll use the property font dash weight colon bold. Let's save, and that will make our text bold. So we're almost there. Now let's make the corners rounded like in the final design. We'll go back to our CSS, and the property for making the corners round is called border dash radius, and we'll make it colon 5 pixels. Let's save, and you can see that it made our corners round. So the pixels here tells the computer how round we want the corners to be. The higher the pixels, the more round it will get. So if we change this to 10 pixels and save, it will make the corners even more round. So let's change this to something really big to make it completely round. We'll change this to 50 pixels and save. And now our button is completely round. The last style we're going to add is in the final design. If we put our mouse over the button, it turns into this hand icon. So we call this a pointer. And we're going to do the same thing in our project. So let's go to our code. And to create that pointer icon, we're going to use the property cursor colon pointer. And let's save and put our mouse over the button. And you'll notice it turns into this hand pointer icon. And that's it. Now our subscribe button looks like the final design. Next, let's click the subscribe button. You'll notice that it only changes the text. But if we click the final design, it also changes the background color and the text color. So we're going to learn how to change the CSS when we click a button. Let's go back to our code, and this time we're going to scroll down to our JavaScript, which is here. So we learned in the previous lesson, we can get HTML elements from the page and put them inside our JavaScript. And we also learned that these HTML elements are just JavaScript objects, and they can have properties like inner text and inner HTML. Every element has another property we can use called class list. Class list gives us control of the class attribute. So one solution we can do is when we click the button, we can add a class. And then this class will have different styles. So let's see how we do that in our code. we'll scroll down to the subscribe function. And when we click the button and make the button subscribed, we're also going to add a class. So let's create a new line and we'll type button element dot class capital L list. So class list itself is an object, which means it has properties and methods we can use. One method is called .add, which adds a class to an element. So after this, let's type .add and brackets. And now inside these brackets, we're going to put a string. So this string is a class that we want to add when we click this button. Let's add a class called is-subscribed and save. So now every time we click this button, it will add a class to the button called is-subscribed. Let's give it a try. First, we'll right-click on the page and then click Inspect. And we'll go to the Elements tab. And I'll rearrange my windows so you can see it. And then inside the HTML, pay attention to the class of the button. Now when we click the button, it's going to add an extra class called is-subscribed. So that's what this line of code does. And now that this button has the is-subscribed class, we can style it in our CSS. So let's go back to our code and we'll scroll up to our CSS. And here we'll type dot to style a class, and we'll style the class is-subscribed. Is-subscribed. And curly brackets. And now inside these curly brackets, let's change the background color to gray and the text color to black. Background dash color colon gray and then color colon black. And make sure to type these styles below the subscribe button styles so that these styles will override the styles above. Now if we save and then click our button, it will add the is-subscribed class, and now this button will get our new styles that we added here. So that's one way to change the CSS when we click a button. All right, now I'm going to move this back to the top. And notice that our background color is different from the final design. The final design uses a much lighter gray. So how do we get this exact color? To do that, we're going to open the Elements tab again. So on this page, we're going to right-click, click Inspect, and then click the Elements tab. And I'll rearrange my windows so we can see it. So in this section, in the Style section, we can see the CSS that the element has. So first, let's actually find this button, which is right here, and we'll click it. And here, it will show us the CSS that this button has. And it will show us the background color that we should use. So let's make a copy of this color and put it into our code. Right-click, copy, and here we'll remove it and right-click and paste. Now let's save and go back to our project and try it out. And now we get the exact